we're here for the benefit of our readers and the people who will watch this, the insomniacs who will watch this on their computers. It's not meant to be equal time. It is meant to be free-flowing. We'd like you to engage with each other. If you would like to respond to something an opponent has said, please don't speak over them. Please wait till they're finished, but please do follow up. We encourage you to engage with each other. We'll have brief introductions where each of you we all know you, but the people who watch this may not have tuned into this race yet, believe it or not. So we're going to ask you to give a brief bio, briefly state why you're running, and then we'll jump into a bunch of questions. Senator Johnson, why don't we start with you, please?
Sure. I'm a native Oregonian, grew up over in Central Oregon. My family was in the timber business, went away to school, came back to go to law school, worked in the Multnomah County courts. I was on the 4-year plan in law school, so I worked in the Multnomah County courts. I spent a lot of time in the Multnomah County jail, which left me with a vocabulary like a pirate. Graduated from law school the day the Trailblazers won the championship. I was invited to go represent the United States flying in Europe and what was then the Soviet Union. So I took off and did that. It gave me a period of thoughtful reflection to realize I really didn't want to practice law. So I came back and started a helicopter company. We did all sorts of things, took bad bears out of the national parks, changed latrines on Mount Rainier, was the U.S. Geological Survey prime contractor to Mount St. Helens for a decade. I flew up there the day of the eruption. We were out of our mind to do that. Had the opportunity to sell the helicopter company, did so, ran for the House, was elected to the House 3 times. 10 days into my 3rd term, the senator was appointed to a remunerative position, and 23 county commissioners, 5 counties, unanimously selected me to take her seat, and then I successfully earned election to that seat from 2005 until December of 2021, when I resigned from the Senate in order to devote full-time to running for governor. And so that's the little brief bio. Beyond that, what did you want?
Well, tell us actually what was it that made you decide that you needed to try and do what only Julius Meyer had done before? Why did you decide you needed to run for governor?
Well, I watched the state that I love get seriously off course, and there's nothing that we should take as Oregonians any pride in, but the fact that Kate Brown is still the most unpopular governor in the nation. Our streets are awash in drugs and crime and violence. Our schools are graduating kids who can't read. 18% of the state think we're doing okay. The rest think we're off track. We've got 8 counties that have actually voted to leave the Oregon family. And I submit that it's our politics that put us here. We've gotten it down to which side wins, which tribe racks up the most votes, and it's playing out in this election right now, where we've got national money pouring in here to influence an Oregon race. We've got political celebrities flying in. We've got dump trucks full of money pouring into this state. And it's all this R or D back and forth, fighting and snapping at each other. I think Oregon's gotten lost in this whole conversation. And my interest in doing this is I love Oregon. I'm embarrassed and saddened by the state that we're in. I chose to run as I did, not affiliated or beholden to any party, but just my state. I've been encouraged to run previously, and I had always said I'd rather throw myself in a wood chipper. But finally, I think we've gotten to the point where Kate Brown's politics have united urban and rural in their common distrust and dissatisfaction with their government. And so I decided that I would enter the race non-affiliated, beholden only to Oregonians and no narrow interests or political agenda or ideology, and I frankly found that liberating.
Thank you. Representative Drazen.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you guys for having us here today. I talk an awful lot about my own personal experiences as an Oregonian as a way to introduce myself in this race. I have not served in the legislature for 20 years. I do not have that kind of sort of notoriety across the state, certainly not among special interests or the donor community per se. And so I have needed to just sort of start from scratch and introduce myself. I'm originally from Klamath Falls. And I talk about that a lot because it is part of what has kind of shaped who I am as a person. Being a small town, coming from a small town actually is very, very different than coming from a metro or suburban or rural part, or like otherwise urban part of the state. And for me, it meant that when I was growing up, I saw firsthand the impacts of public policies that were handed down from metro areas or from parts of the state that didn't know what it meant to make a remote area work. And so that meant that our community was less stable, and certainly my family was as well. It taught me the value of hard work. It certainly kind of instilled in me some character that I hold today and that I'm proud of today, to commit to participate in my own community and do everything that I can to make things better. And I went on from living in Klamath Falls. My parents kind of moved across the hill, and I graduated from Eagle Point High School, which is another small town outside of Medford. I put myself through college at George Fox, and then worked briefly at a public relations firm before making the decision to just see what it was all about inside our political life in Salem. And I worked in Salem as a staff person for 8 years. And half of that time I was somebody's chief of staff. The other half of the time I was the equivalent of chief bottle washer. John Kitzhaber was the Democrat in the center office, and Republicans had majority control of both chambers. I happened to have been there during the 5 special sessions and the issues that followed the 9/11 attacks. And the experience of being chief of staff to the Speaker of the House during those very difficult times gave me insight into the upside of divided government. Initially, in John Kitzhaber's term, if you guys will recall, he was not so affectionately referred to as Dr. No for all of his vetoes. And then over time, there was this process where both sides began to understand how to work together and how to compromise and how to negotiate with each other and get some things done. And throughout his tenure, he actually ended up being a very successful governor, working very collaboratively by the end with the Republican legislature. I had a front row seat to the fireworks and to what it took to actually get to yes on both sides. I'm grateful for that experience, but at that time my husband and I by then had gotten married, and our firstborn was about a little under a year old, and he was learning how to walk and crawl in the state capitol more than anywhere else. And I didn't want to live that life with a family, and so I left and I came home to Clackamas County. And I worked for an association, and I led a nonprofit. I got involved in my community. I served on the planning commission. I served in every capacity I could relative to my kids' schools. And again, I committed to do what I could to make things better. So for me, that meant serving as a coach for the Girls on the Run program and serving as a mentor in that capacity. I led the Kid Governor program in our kids' school, leadership councils, whatever I could do to engage and support not just my own kids, but all the kids in our local regionals, in our schools there. And from there, my own state rep made the decision to retire. And folks said, would you ever think about running for office yourself? And while I didn't really think of it as a wood chipper, because it wasn't running for governor at the time, I really did weigh whether or not I wanted to go from being a private person to being a public one. And that's the question. When you enter into elected office, it's a huge jump from being behind the scenes to choosing to say, this is my name, this is what I'm about, this is my story, and this is what I believe. And my family was supportive. It's funny, I talked to everybody in my family. My daughter, her only thing was, will you be home for breakfast? She was 10 years old at the time, and now she's 15, and she's not asking that same question. But I believe in our process. I believe in our civic life. I believe that government in particular can do things to help people. I think government run amok can harm people. That was my experience growing up. That was certainly my parents' perspective on this thing. But that there is a way to balance interests and actually serve the common good. And as I served in the legislature, it was my intent and my commitment to lead in that capacity, to do everything I could to work across the aisle when that was possible, but to hold power to account when it was not. And I went on to run for governor because I recognize that in our state, we need two viable parties. The way that we look at our political life right now as if we are a true blue, hard blue only state, it's just not accurate. I've traveled the whole state, and I can tell you that Oregonians want more balance. They want to recognize all the things they have in common. They want people to stop scaring them, to stop dividing them, and to remind them the things that make our state great, and frankly, to remind them that there is a future here that they can be proud of, that they can plan for, and that their kids, in fact, should stay for. And that has been a privilege and a part of running for governor that I'm grateful for. I'm the keeper of Oregonians' hopes and dreams. And I will fight for them as governor of the future. And the future of our state, their hopes and dreams are dependent on who's elected in this cycle. And you just can't believe the hype. I mean, right now in this race, I think the thing that's been most stunning to me is the way that in order to hold on to power, so much of this race has been pushing people back into their corners on very divisive issues. When what Oregonians talk about in the day-to-day life, they're not partisan issues. They're in fact not divisive issues. They're issues that we all three agree need to be addressed. Homelessness, crime, education, public safety, those are all issues that the three of us talk about all the time. Those aren't partisan issues. Those are issues Oregonians need us to work on. And as a Republican governor, I will have the privilege and the opportunity, like John Kitzhaber did, to work with the Democrat legislature to solve those problems in a way that is balanced and serves all Oregonians.
Great, thank you very much. Speaker Kotek.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It's nice to see you all. Since we're doing a little bit of bios, I moved to Oregon in 1987, grew up on the East Coast, but moved out to Eugene at a time when I was coming out as a lesbian and found a state that I could be myself, and ended up going back to school at the University of Oregon. I had dropped out of college back on the East Coast, and when I came here, I settled in and was able to go back to school, got a degree in religious studies at the University of Oregon. Had the advantage of getting a Pell Grant, having work study, being able to graduate without any debt, put me on a nice solid financial footing to grow in this state. And after I went to graduate school, I came back to Oregon in 1998 and wanted to do something to make the world better. I had been fighting when I was in graduate school to make sure people could have access to domestic partner benefits. This is back in the mid-90s. And what I learned through that experience was not only do I need to stand up for myself and my community, I need to stand up for others, for fairness and equality. Those were driving factors for me. So I got really fortunate. I moved back to Oregon and got a job at Oregon Food Bank. I became a public policy advocate. Actually, I first got hired to be an admin because I was a great typist. I typed my way through college. But there was an opening, and so I became a public policy advocate for Oregon Food Bank. And my job was to figure out not to move the food boxes. That was a good chunk of what Oregon Food Bank does. It was to figure out how we could change public policy so people could afford to buy their own food and not have to go to the food pantry. And so my job was to literally travel the state, talking to folks, what was going on in their lives, travel to every corner of our state in that position. And the stories were about people working but not working, 2-3 jobs, not being able to afford because they weren't making enough to actually buy their own food. A lot of people with medical debt. This was pre-Obamacare, so a lot of people, were so far in debt from their medical bills, particularly people with disabilities. So I went to work. In fact, my job was to advocate at the legislature. I was the head of the Human Services Coalition of Oregon during the 5 special sessions, when we were looking at budget cuts. So I've always been very focused on making sure that people who are vulnerable, don't have the services they need, have a champion. So I've been an advocate my entire life, and so I was at Oregon Food Bank for 5 years-ish, 4.5, then moved to Children First for Oregon, became the policy director there, and that was mostly working on trying to get all kids health insurance. This was in Kulongoski's administration. Worked on child welfare issues, child care issues, things that would improve things for working families, and ran for the legislature in 2004. Got in a race very late because there was only one person in the race. I didn't win that race. Chip Shields won that race. Ran 2 years later and won in 2006. I've been in the legislature. I was there for 15 years. really focusing on human service issues, healthcare issues, housing issues, making sure that, everyday Oregonians could actually make ends meet. I did become Speaker in 2013 when Democrats came back in the majority, and served there as Speaker of the House for 9 years. Longest serving Speaker. That was never the intent. Year after year, I'd be like, well, if there's things to do to help make things better for people, I'm going to stick around. And then the last 2 years in the pandemic, just very eye-opening about how hard things were. We would have many conversations about how things weren't working. And last August, my wife and I sat down and said, there's going to be a new governor, and we have to make sure things work. And I decided to run because I want things to work. I am tired of things not working. When you are a legislator, you pass budgets, you pass bills, you assume the executive branch is actually going to follow through on those things, and we just haven't seen that. And I think the next 4 years are so critical for Oregon to rebuild, to build back, build a future for Oregon where people can be successful. And the particular crises that are facing our state are things that I care about a lot: housing, homelessness, mental health, and addiction. And I just want state government to be more effective. And right now it's not working very well. And frankly, people need it to work. And so that's why I'm running for governor.
Great. So I'm going to go through a number of questions, hopefully pretty quickly, so please try and be brief on these next few questions. They'll be for everybody. The first question is that all of you have made housing and homelessness a central part of the campaign. So what specifically would you do if you were elected governor to make those situations better? We'll start with you, Rep. Drazen.
Thank you. When it comes to the approach that we've taken in the last decade or so, it really has been a housing first approach. And I give Speaker Kotek credit in particular for the changes that she made to land use laws to make the opportunity available for more dense housing. That wasn't something that my community wanted, and as a state representative, I voted against that bill, but I see the need for it. I also recognize, though, that when it comes to the homeless challenges, that approach wasn't the right approach to take singularly. A housing first approach is not the challenge, is not all that's involved in our homeless crisis. And to just simply mess around with land use and fund more tiny homes isn't going to get it done. So I will declare a homelessness state of emergency on day one of my administration, because what I believe actually needs to happen is a better understanding of who is on our streets and what they need for services and supports, and to ensure that the state is in fact supporting local governments. They're under this Ninth Circuit Court ruling, which is tying their hands day after day. It feels like it gets tighter and tighter on them. And I believe that the state needs to intervene and provide a way out for local government so that we can in fact begin to see progress on our streets. That means compassion and accountability.
So what specifically would be, we've lived under a housing emergency in this city for 7 or 8 years, and as far as I can tell, it hasn't changed anything.
Yeah.
So what would the effect of the governor declaring a housing emergency actually be?
So you guys, you're talking about a housing emergency. I'm talking about a homelessness emergency.
Okay.
So to be clear, those are two very different things. One has to do with land use, one has to do with permitting. What I'm talking about is the idea that you can marshal state resources from DHS and OHA and the housing entities, and you can collaborate across platforms, across jurisdictions, and to begin to clear the decks to get people into the supports that they need. And the other side of that has to be that in the end, you have met the threshold that the courts require of us, and that local governments are in fact allowed to make sure that our streets are clear and our public spaces are clear, because people are choosing to not voluntarily go into what's available to them. They then would have the capacity to be able to restore open streets again. And right now that's not possible.
Thank you. Speaker Kotek, what specifically would you do if you were elected?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, and I do think the housing and homelessness crisis are related, but let's particularly talk about people who are unsheltered, because I do think that is the question of the moment. Back in 2019, at the end of 2019, the state issued a report on unsheltered homelessness, and it was striking. We are, compared to other states, we have a high percentage of people who consider themselves homeless who are actually unsheltered, and it's obviously gotten worse. So after reading that report, and Oregon puts a lot of reports out, but I actually read it, I came into the 2020 session in January of 2020, and I said, we got to do something about this. And that was nearly 3 years ago, and I called for a homelessness state of emergency back in 2020. Came into the February 20 session with specific investments in navigation centers, which was a recommendation for communities outside of Portland, frankly, from Eugene, Springfield, to Bend, Salem, McMinnville. So communities outside of Portland could also do their part to address unsheltered homelessness. $100 million more affordable housing in that session, plus a policy bill that said let's try to expedite permitting for shelters. That was my plan going into the 20 session. And what happened was, as we all know, nothing happened. Governor Brown didn't do anything, and the session fell apart when the Republicans walked out, and we really lost momentum. I mean, I can't tell you the people who said to me, now what, right? When are we going to come back to this conversation? We lost probably an entire year of momentum of moving forward on addressing unsheltered homelessness. And of course, the pandemic hit, in March of 2020. Going forward, I have a plan on my website. I feel like I've given specific details. As it relates to...
Right, I've read your plan,
Yeah.
but please condense it for us.
I will. I won't go on.
Tell us
So one thing that I think is important, so
specifics.
speaking not just in Portland speak, is that when people lose their housing, it is preferable that they stay in their own communities because they have social capital there, they have networks of support. That's why I have supported services in other cities so people can stay in their communities, get services quicker, and get rehoused. So that is really important. In the metro area...
Can I get you to focus on what specifically you would do as governor? Because you're giving us a lot of background, a lot of history, which is great. What would you
day
do?
one, I will concur. I'm going to go back to the same argument I made 3 years ago, which is we need a homelessness state of emergency for the purpose of bringing the urgency to the agencies to say, hey, there's a lot of things you have to do, but we have to move this issue of unsheltered homelessness to the front of your agenda because it's not happening. And locally, I think being in the issues here in Portland, right? Specifically funding more outreach teams. And I know people don't think that's the answer, but unless people living on the streets have someone they can communicate with and feel comfortable with, they're not going to get connected to services. You need to get connected to services, get into transitional housing, like converted motels that we at the state and through my leadership got done with Project Turnkey. We need more converted motels. People have to have safety of a room. Once they do, we can talk about getting into permanent housing. I was just at Blanchet House yesterday. I asked them, I said, what do you need? Do you know what Portland needs right now? We need more showers and toilets. That is something we can do concretely here in Portland. And one thing that I will do, even before I'm sworn in, is have a hard conversation with Multnomah County about how they're assessing people on the street right now. We are assessing people and trying to house the highest need folks first, when the people who are more engaged go to the bottom of the list. We have to make progress. If you're engaged, have case management, or are working, you should be housed first, so we can then spend more time with the other people who need more services. We're just doing it backwards here, and we're not seeing enough progress.
Great. Okay, Senator Johnson, before I give your answer first, then I want to come back to Project Turnkey, because you and I have talked about that before. Good. Please go ahead. What would you do if elected right away to address the homelessness issue and the housing issue?
Sure, well, they got a preamble, so I'm gonna take a whole preamble.
Okay.
Unlike people that are planning and thinking about it and talking about it and declaring emergencies, I've been doing it. I'm part of the group that has reanimated the former Wapato and turned it into the Bybee Lakes Hope Center. Not without a considerable amount of controversy and no help from the county or the city when we first started. We were demonized for being high barrier. That happens to be a model that has worked, and it has worked successfully in the 11 other facilities that the not-for-profit that's running Bybee Lakes Hope Center has been running for damn near 20 years. So I'm not talking about it, I'm doing it, and I have done it previously. Tillamook was underwater when I was in the legislature, and we got quick action there. But especially Vernonia, 2 500-year floods in the space of a decade that literally wiped Vernonia off the map. We had a profound sense of urgency, began moving people in right away, moving in alternative housing. That's the thing that has been missing for me. So on the first day, the 9th, I would convene the key players, social services, law enforcement, addiction specialists, mental health specialists, city and county officials through AOC, the Association of Oregon Counties, and the League of Oregon Cities, so that we had more than just a Portland perspective. Make sure that we start assigning obligations, deliverables, dates when those projects or activities were supposed to be completed, budgets assigned, and people that were accountable to get those jobs done. We are creating, somebody told me, I haven't independently verified this, but somebody told me that we have closing in on 300 not-for-profits that are talking about homelessness with all of their concomitant costs, their executive directors, their development people, blah, blah, blah. And we're still better at pitching tents than pulling permits. And so I think creating a sense of urgency and accountability is going to be very important. And if the folks assigned to deliver on certain tasks don't, or they want to shift the blame to somebody else, get new people. That's been the problem that I've had with a lot of this. We just throw money at it. Look at how much money is sloshing around Loma County right now, but we're not moving the dial. I want to get a baseline. How many people are on the streets? What's the profile? Why are they there? Is it domestic violence? Is it addiction? Is it mental health? Is it criminality? And try to get a profile. And then, as Vitae Lakes has so successfully done, is try to begin to form solutions around individuals. It's going to be a slow slog, but I happen to agree that the one-on-one navigation of the system is something that folks are going to need. That's one of the benefits of Vitae Lakes as we aggregate mental health, physical health, and the services in one place. And now I'd be happy to go back to Project Turnkey because
Yes, please, go ahead. Go ahead. First of all, could you explain for our viewers who won't necessarily know what Project Turnkey is, what it is, and why you and the speaker disagree on it?
Sure. And fundamentally, we don't. I'm down as a fiscal watchdog on Turnkey. Turnkey was the acquisition of motels and hotels that willing sellers would sell to the state of Oregon to be purchased with public money. We ended up outsourcing all of that activity to the Oregon Community Foundation for a variety of reasons. I didn't certainly agree with all of them, but the state's inability to get projects started, I'm sure, was at the core of why we were doing it, and our poor performance on project initiation. But we outsourced this work to the Oregon Community Foundation and then poured money into OCF. I didn't disagree with the concept. What I disagreed with was the lack of fiscal accountability. Nobody, to my satisfaction, had assessed the condition of some of these properties. What would it take to turn what were transient lodging into permanent habitation, like kitchens in bedrooms or showers, or ADA showers, elevators. How long had maintenance been deferred that might have caused the property to be listed for sale? How much hidden deferred maintenance was there? And my very profound concern that if we didn't work out appropriate, accurate fiscal models, that when some of the not-for-profits that took over these properties could not financially sustain the operation, that they would be back at the general fund begging for more state support. So I was looking for financial accountability because my problem right straight along has been that of money. We have no benchmarks to account how many people we've taken off the streets, but my problem with Turnkey right straight along was, what are the conditions of those properties? What's going to be the sustainable financial model? Because all too often those properties were coming into the portfolio of small not-for-profits that had depended on the kindness of strangers and contributions to run their core operation, much less take on properties in various conditions and in various need of capital maintenance or capital construction to make them long-term durable housing options.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to respond to that? Otherwise, we'll move on.
Yeah, just briefly. We're in a crisis.
Squirrel trying to get in really badly.
He wants housing too. Yeah.
Everybody wants housing. We're in a crisis. I don't disagree that we need accountability on what we do. And I wouldn't talk about Oregon Community Foundation as outsourcing. What I would say is we develop a strong private-public partnership with someone who could move these dollars quickly and do the due diligence. They brought a team of experts in to do the due diligence on all these properties. They didn't buy crappy properties. They bought ones that could do the job. State doesn't own them. These community partners own them. I visited many of them around the state since we've started. In only 7 months, Project Turnkey was able to increase shelter capacity statewide by 20%. Almost 900 units.
So are the properties owned by Oregon OCS?
They are owned, no. They are owned by the partners who do the project. So in many cases, local governments with community nonprofits who run them, right? They're different for each
Housing
one.
nonprofit.
Yeah. We were in the pandemic. We needed to have people, we have properties. The moment said, let's get these properties. We need, obviously, ongoing oversight and accountability, but to stop and say, we don't want to do this right now because we're not quite sure it's right. I'm sorry, we're in a crisis. I can be impatient when people need help, and we just disagree on the urgency of it, I think, so.
Quick follow-up, sure, yeah, go ahead.
The Project Turnkey model has not been completely successful in California. And while I don't disagree with the speaker that there's a certain amount of urgency, I still think there's an accountability element. We're spending public money in triple-digit millions. I think we owe it to the citizens of Oregon to say that we're making a long-term investment. We're not crippling these not-for-profits that have taken the motels into their portfolio, that there is a sustainable plan. And I'll just bet you as we go forward that some of these are going to be back to the general fund saying we are unable to sustain operations or long-term maintenance at a level commensurate with having many people live in these facilities. That was my concern. I saw large-scale, yes, it can work, yes, there's urgency, yes, we need to do this. I wanted to get into the details of each one of the properties and find out what's the long-term sustainability. And I think if you review the literature in California, you're going to find that the Project Turnkey model down there has not been successful entirely.
So I want
Right,
to say
right.
one thing about Project Turnkey very briefly. My experience in Project Turnkey, I supported it when it was first proposed. They went after a very rural, remote, single hotel in the community of Estacada, no services, one bus route once a day, nothing out there, just as a way literally to address the homeless challenge with an out-of-sight, out-of-mind approach. And it would have been the only hotel in that community which they were dependent on long-term for economic activity. So you get the fires, they shut down the highway going into that community, and then you take their only hotel, you turn it into homeless housing. From my perspective, the approach to Project Turnkey, over the course of COVID, of course, a lot of those hotels were in distress. Our economy had been shut down, and some of those hotel owners were anxious to get out from underneath that debt. But in some cases, it's not the right fit for the homeless populations, and it's certainly not the right fit for the community. And this idea that we're going to move full steam ahead and run full steam ahead no matter what, details, who cares? Does not support our long-term approach to homelessness. And certainly in the case of my own community, they were a case study in homeless response gone wrong.
Great,
Do
thanks.
you know just how many beds Project Turnkey had?
In the first wave of the 70 million, about 850 units.
So there are 850.
That was in the
rooms.
first new shelter beds, yes, with services. Most of these have been shelters, they're transitional shelters, and most of them have services with them, people on site. I just think on the piece that Representative Drazen's talking about, the they was a community effort that some people didn't agree with. I don't know all the details of that one, but every community has folks who are living on the edge and can become unhoused, and we just shouldn't ignore that fact.
To be clear,
Okay,
I do know
but-
the details on that.
Let's move on. Let's move on. We got a lot to cover, and Project Turnkey we could spend the rest of the day on. Tell us, Speaker Kotek, nobody can use the employment department as their example in the next question. Which state agency is most in need? You've talked about the need for the governor to more closely manage state agencies or oversee state agencies. Which state agency, aside from the employment department, is most in need of a governor's attention, and why?
Oregon Health Authority.
Why do you say that?
So when the legislature invests $500 million more on top of what we currently spend on mental health and addiction, and the Oregon Health Authority doesn't have a plan, can't mobilize the different initiatives that are necessary to move those dollars, that's a problem. When an agency, and this is mostly around behavioral health, but we can talk about other aspects of the health authority, but on the behavioral health side, their inability to really respond to what voters wanted in Measure 110 and move those dollars is unconscionable. And all I heard were excuses, excuses, excuses. Governor Brown was absent. They couldn't move the money. Now the money's finally out. But it's still hemming and hawing about, well, we're not sure we can do that. We gave them more money for residential beds, no plan, not happening. We have a mental health and addiction crisis in our state. I can't tell you how many conversations I have with people in the field and their frustrations with the health authority. That is the number one goal for me right now. And behavioral health is in my target because we just gotta be better.
Okay, so there are two Allens at that agency. Pat Allen leads it, Steve Allen leads
Right.
behavioral health.
There won't be any
Will- will
Allens
it-
there anymore.
Okay, so they will not be there. Okay. Senator Johnson, same question for you. Which state agency? You could pick OHA or you could pick another one to expand our universe of understanding.
Quick,
state
write
government.
this down. Tina and I agree, it's OHA. It's
Okay.
too big, it's ungovernable, it's unmanageable. Pat Allen was hired to run an insurance program, not see the state through a pandemic. The episodic, heavy-handed, and contradictory COVID guidance, the on-again, off-again that I think damaged businesses irreparably. And Steve Allen has been in a honeymoon period now for, I don't remember how long he's been there, at least 3 years. And I think he's more worried about pronouns than he is about fixing stuff. The honeymoon ends, it's time to get to work. I don't know what his training is in the mental health arena. I know that he was a lobbyist for the Council of State Governments. I know that accommodation was made to pay him a lot of money to bring him to Oregon, and our mental health crisis has spiraled downward under his leadership. So Tina and I agree, OHA, top of the list.
Thank you. Representative Drazen.
I'll give a nod to OHA because they're top of my list too, but to be clear, let's talk about Oregon Department of Education. I mean, we have Colt Gill running the Oregon Department of Education. Over the course of COVID, he had the opportunity to respond in a way that was nimble and responsive to students. Instead, he doubled down on this very, very, very political approach to our kids in our schools that said, we can't do new things. And we need to be as slow as we possibly can and leave kids behind. There is no doubt that Kate Brown and, frankly, my opponents threw kids under the bus when it came to COVID. But when we're talking about agencies and agency responsiveness, even now, given the shocking scores that we got out of our schools recently, even now, Colt Gill is still talking about social and emotional health and not nearly focused enough on academic outcomes. He is the wrong guy for the wrong job at the wrong time.
So you're fired,
Absolutely.
just for the video.
For the record, he's gone.
Great, thank you. So, Senator Johnson, we've talked a little bit about behavioral health, but the Democrats, which used to be your party, have been in control in Salem almost exclusively since 2007, except for the 1 year the House was tied. And I know that you and all three of you gave a lot more money for behavioral health in the most recent session, but we still rank near the bottom in access to mental health services, substance abuse services. We have one of the highest rates of addiction in the country. You're no longer a Democrat, but you were a Democrat for the past 20 years. So could you explain why this state, which professes to care so much about the most vulnerable citizens, does so little for them?
Sure. I think part of it has hinged on this general notion of justice reinvestment and getting people out of institutions. The promise that was made back when John F. Kennedy was president about emptying some of the larger and then arguably very inhumane institutions and providing services back in local communities. That promise was never fulfilled. We have been very interested in not spending money on putting people into the Oregon State Hospital. I applaud President Peter Courtney on his rehabilitation of the physical plant there. I remember the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, filmed in that facility. He turned it into a bright, modern clinical space. But I don't think that there was ever the same urgency to provide adequate funding for staff. The paucity of available mental health staff has accelerated the problems that we've had in running the state hospital. The state hospital's budget was buried inside OHA. On my time in Ways and Means, we managed to drag that budget out so that you could see the deficiencies. I think there's been bad management at OHA. Back, I don't know how long ago, we had 6,000 mental health beds, including the facility over in Pendleton, which was subsequently turned into a prison. I think OHA is now down to about 550 plus another handful at Junction City. We've been on again, off again, opening Junction City. It's always characterized as a money crisis. I don't think that's it. I think that there has been a profound bias against institutionalization. And as I think Christine mentioned, at some point we're going to have the conversation about what to do with people who are a danger to themselves and others. Mentally ill and drug addicted people do not make good decisions about their own well-being or the well-being of others. And then I think the other thing that's exacerbating and accelerating the mental health crisis in Oregon was our laissez-faire attitude about drugs, including the voter-passed ballot measure 110. I campaigned against that. I voted against it. I think if the Oregon voters had an honest conversation, I mean, the question was posed to them, treatment or incarceration? Well, that's like saying you want world peace. Check, yes. But I don't think anybody ever dug deeply enough into the practical effects of legalizing drugs and turning Portland, for example, into an open-air drug market. I don't know how many people's deteriorating mental health has been exacerbated by very potent, very available, very, in some cases, inexpensive drugs. So we've had the combination of mismanagement of the state hospital. We've found plenty of money to throw at other stuff with questionable efficacy. The $200 million that the legislature, at the urging of the presiding officers, put into schools after COVID. I've heard from school administrators and classroom teachers that was not money well spent, so our priorities have not focused on mental health. We've had, as we all have, at least Tina and I commented on, poor leadership in the mental health arena. The fact that we're 50th in mental health is a state shame on all of us. So, I mean, those are some of the reasons.
Great. Thank you, Representative Drazen. Same question. Why are we so deficient in our approach to mental health and substance abuse?
Because of my opponents. I mean, they've literally been in charge for this entire time. Betsy was the Ways and Means co-chair. Tina was the Speaker of the House. The opportunity to see the real challenges facing our state and address them were entirely within their control. We talk about high barrier shelters, low barrier shelters. There is no lower barrier to progress and improvement and achieving your goals and your vision for the future of the state than having single party control. That's what my opponents enjoyed, single party control.
So the consequence of single party control was that what, Tina and Betsy didn't spend enough money on mental health, or what didn't they do?
It's that the priorities primarily went to political agenda. So we had these extensive, long conversations where it was nuclear war over cap and trade, when the day-to-day of governing was completely set aside. And all it was political gamesmanship every single day inside that building, when what we needed were people who were willing to work together and run government. Like, if you take a look at what they're doing in other states when it relates specifically to behavioral health, they're getting pretty innovative. Like when we're talking about behavioral health apprenticeships and behavioral health aides and more peer-to-peer. And we do a lot of that in Oregon. We're starting down that road. But this is not a new problem. We've had a meth challenge in Oregon for a decade. And so then we double down and we say we're going to cut off our nose to spite our face and we're just going to legalize hard drugs. But this is not a new challenge for our state. This has been a long time in coming. And when you talk about the challenges in our schools, and if you're talking about preventing people from getting into the criminal justice system, you need strong schools, you need strong families, you need less drug use, you need less drug abuse. And all of these things are not new issues. All of these things have been out there. The communities, the advocates have been saying, this is a problem, this is a challenge, focus, focus, focus. And instead we've been having these global political conversations that are more about national politics than what it's like to live here as an Oregonian.
Great, thank you.
Nigel, can I respond, or do you want to go to Tina?
Quick, please be quick, and then we'll go to Tina.
I'll be very quick. I find it interesting that Christine says, work together and run government. I just would like to know how that worked out when she was poolside in Reno instead of staying here and running government.
I'd like to know how it worked out when you were poolside. You walked out in 2001 for politics. Pure politics, not even standing up on behalf of Oregonians, just political control.
Betsy, where are you on the constitutional amendment that would, give the party in power the ability to basically fire legislators who have more than 10 unexcused absences? I know where these two stand.
I oppose it because of the unexcused absences. The presiding officers have the ability to grant or not grant those excused absences. And I think I watched it be horribly abused. And that troubles me that someone's ability to run for office could be manipulated by the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House.
Okay.
Okay, great. So, same question for you, Speaker. Why have our results been so bad?
So are you against the measure too? I'm just curious.
Okay, sure.
Against what?
Yeah, no, I'm like, are you for the
Oh, I'm
measure?
assuming, I'm sorry, I assume that you are opposed to the constitutional amendment that
Yes,
would...
yeah, because in fact, I believe in single-party controlled states, the minority needs to have a voice, and they didn't here, and they could have, but they chose. But the speaker in particular chose to just run roughshod over every single minority opinion and every single minority perspective throughout the session.
So that measure simply says that if you walk off the job for 10 days, you don't get to run again. That's what that measure says. And as Speaker of the House, I want to make sure that, people understand what's, I've excused absences like, got a flat tire. I'm like, people have a lot of reasons why they can't come to work. They're very clear. It's also very clear when someone walks off the job for quorum purposes. There's a real difference there. And all this measure says is if you walk off the job to inhibit quorum, which is still in the Constitution, then you're making a statement, but there should be consequences for that, because if you leave your job in the private sector, you get fired, right? So
Don't you believe in democracy? Don't you think that citizens
course
can
I do.
decide whether or not they want to re-elect someone after their decision to deny quorum, which in fact is a procedural process that's available to minorities. They did it in Texas. I didn't hear you stand up then.
Let's,
just for the record, I don't believe in walkouts. I
Okay.
told the president that. I'm like, I wasn't there when they walked out back in 01. I don't think that's the way you should
okay,
do
all
business.
right. So why, you have built your career
So let's talk
around
about
human
mental.
services.
So let's talk about. The
Yes.
question was.
Yes,
Why are
why
we at
is
the bottom?
Oregon at the
Let's
bottom
go back
of
to
the
the
barrel
question.
in an area that's so important to you, and you
Really
had
important
control?
question. So I don't want to get into too much history, but let's remember the Great Recession. I know people have short memories,
That
but
happened in all 50 states.
no, I understand that.
Yeah.
But we were particularly hit hard by our over-reliance on the income tax, right? I chaired that committee at the time. We made massive cuts across the board on all kinds of things. So we have not substantially rebuilt from the cuts of the Great Recession. I also think that in Oregon, when the way we're set up, the counties are the mental health authority. That has created an extra layer of confusion, I think, to actually serve people. Other states are a lot more centralized. I don't think we've held our coordinated care organizations to account. When we did the last 5-year contract for our CCOs on the Medicaid side, I made sure that one of their goals was behavioral health integration. We're not seeing that. And when the legislature says, make this better, we assume the executive is going to do it. It hasn't happened. I'm going to hold our coordinated care organizations accountable for mental health integration. When I hear that Care Oregon, here in the metro area, has not spent all their behavioral health dollars when we're in a crisis, I'm astounded, pissed off. I can't even tell you how I feel about it. That has to change, right? People on the street today, they all have Medicaid. They are all covered. We have worked hard to get everybody on the health plan or private insurance or in the exchange, whatever. When the CCOs aren't paying attention, that is a problem. And again, I believe OHA and the governor has been absent on this issue. They don't care enough. I do. My wife's a social worker. This will be different when I'm governor because we have to have these things work.
So I think the question that voters, I know your opponents have, and voters have across the state is, okay, we've had this 15-year period of Democratic control. You've been in charge for much of that as Speaker of the House. You've had a leadership position. Things are bad now. Why would they be any different if we gave you 4 years?
I think things are bad now. And this is the time to have strong, decisive leadership. And as the Speaker of the House, when it came to working on very comprehensive problems, raising the minimum wage, paid sick leave, getting a negotiated paid family medical leave program on the books. By the way, we would have had one years ago if Senator Johnson had voted for one in 2007. But now we have one that's coming online next year. These are really big problems. The ability to work with a lot of different people to get to a conclusion, to move something forward is really needed right now.
So
And-
if we were to look at the 100 most influential businesses in Oregon, about 98% of them support either of your opponents. They don't support you. How, if you are elected, are you going to bring,
You mean the CEOs of those companies?
Yes.
Support
yes,
my
those
opponents?
two, yes.
Just
Yes,
being
the
clear.
CEOs, which means they have confidence that either of them would be a better governor than you. So if you were to be elected, what confidence could you give us that
You know
we
what's
would
really
bring those
interesting
people to
about
table?
that? So I talk to these folks, I don't ignore them.
Yeah.
And I won't name names, but it's like, we think you're going to be you'd be a very competent, successful governor. We just don't agree. We would rather have someone who's ready to unravel regulations that Oregonians think are important, doesn't like the fact that we have said, there should be equal pay for equal work, there should be paid sick leave, things that are very basic, and thank God we have them now. This is a values difference. They all know I can be a good governor, they know I've been effective, they know they can work with me, and they are choosing to support the conservatives because of their individual business interests. Let's just be really clear. I mean, that's okay, that's their political choice, but it's not because they think I can't do the job. In fact, they know I can do the job, they want someone else because they're worried that I'm actually going to be effective.
Can I ask a slightly different question that gets into the issue of accountability? All three of you have identified the Oregon Health Authority as an agency desperately in need of reform. At the most recent meeting of the E-Board, the E-Board gave hospitals $11 million. This was right after the New York Times had published a scathing story about Providence's predatory behavior. Elizabeth Steiner Hayward is on the Budget Committee and on the E-Board. I asked her about it, and she said, I said, why did you come to the conclusion that Providence, as an example, which has $1 billion in assets, is engaged in predatory behavior, needs a couple $1 million? And she said, well, I have implicit faith in the Oregon Health Authority and their analysis. So here you have a leader of your party who's giving money away to hospitals based on the say-so of an agency that the three of you think is completely upside down. It's really a question for you, Tina, and your party.
Well, I wasn't there for that vote. And I wasn't the head of the E-Board then. I'm not sure I would have done it that way. So let's be clear. So what we all know is hospitals under significant strain from the pandemic. What is really interesting is the hospitals have been claiming that they don't have any money and everyone's leaving. We don't have a nursing shortage in our hospitals. We have a bunch of folks who don't want to work for hospitals that have treated them badly. They're not paying them well. They're hiring the traveling nurses. They're creating incredibly unsafe workplaces for their staff, and they're wondering why people don't want to work for them. Now, the piece that was important in that package was long-term care facilities in particular are suffering right now, and the hospitals need to be able to move people to the next level of care, which is step-down skilled nursing facilities. So that piece, I think, was important, because it is very difficult right now because of the COVID protocols on these facilities for them to function. On the hospital side, frankly, I think they have the money. Both of my opponents are supported by the hospital CEOs, so you can ask them. I'm supported by the nurses because I think we have an imbalance of power here, and the hospitals need to step up and actually pay their own bills.
Well, but your party voted to give these hospitals the money. I realize you weren't there, but
The Democrats on the E-Board voted. That's to say it's the party. I wasn't there for the vote, so.
Okay, so, it's funny because in many ways, the three of you women are running against a woman who's not in the room, and that's the incumbent governor. And maybe this is a question more for you, because I have a feeling it's easier for the two of them to answer. Why is Kate Brown the least popular governor in America?
I think she's been absent on the issues that matter to Oregonians. We need decisive leadership right now, and the biggest issues facing our state, which we have talked about, housing, homelessness, and mental health and addiction, have not been her thing. On things that she has actually engaged on, let's talk about the private timber accord. She was all in on that. It was successful, frankly, a signature piece of achievement in her administration. But those other things that people care about, not a priority. And I think people are responding to that. They're responding to the fact that under her leadership, the executive agencies haven't functioned well. That was very apparent and magnified in the pandemic. And again, it's one of the reasons I'm running. The executive side of government has to work. And it needs leadership, it needs management.
Same question for you, Representative Drazen. Why is Governor Brown so unpopular?
She is unpopular because she didn't have the benefit of being required to temper her own party. She had leadership in the legislature that didn't hold her to account because they were in the same party. She had overwhelming majorities. And so the ability to serve more Oregonians and come to the middle, which would have in fact made her more likable, would have made people more grateful for her leadership. She was never required to do that, and therefore she did not. But I would also just like to say, Kate Brown has a lot of failings, but she was never dishonest with me. She was always honest. And I cannot say the same thing for Tina Kotek. And so while they are of the same party, if Tina is stepping in and saying Kate did all these things wrong and she was absent, okay, she might have been absent because she took everything for granted, because Democrats always win in Oregon. But she was always honest, and Tina Kotek was not.
And you're specifically talking about the redistricting issue, or?
Yeah, in my experience. But I can tell you that even among her own party, the way she treated Janelle Bynum, the list is not exclusive to a highly partisan, highly charged redistricting issue. We're talking about a central character flaw when the issue becomes, it's just a political decision, ethics get thrown out the window. And that was not Kate Brown. She was not a strong leader. She responded when she should have responded with information and respect for Oregonians. That was Kate. And she had too much power, and she didn't have enough people holding her to account and frankly elevating expectations of her. She never had that from the legislature or her own party. But that's very different than a central character flaw that Tina Kotek happens to have.
Want to respond to that?
Etsy?
What?
Oh,
No, I
Go
think
ahead, answer the question.
hang on. I'm sorry. I think if you're going to call it dishonest.
Go ahead.
I mean, Representative Drazen's entitled to her opinion. I would say you don't stay Speaker of the Oregon House for 9 years if you can't live by your word. And I can give you plenty of examples of I've fought tooth and nail for things over the years because I made a promise. If we want to talk about what happened around redistricting, we can definitely do that. But I pride myself on working hard, being honest, and doing the best thing I can every single day. So, yeah, I take offense to that, but she's entitled to her opinion.
Okay, so Senator Johnson, you worked alongside Senator Brown when she was a senator, and you've known her forever. Why is she the least popular governor in this country?
Well, you just took my opening. I've known Kate for a long time. I think when she became governor, it was sort of the example of dog catches car. You've got what you want, now you've got to execute. And I just don't think she knew how to make executive decisions. That was nowhere more obvious, the lack of decisive leadership than at the commencement of the pandemic. I remember vividly the first press availability. That was not anything that any public affairs guy would give 5 marks to. Nice lady, but highly partisan, secretive, contradictory, put politics front and center in her office. The fact that SEIU is embedded in that office and she takes her cues there. I've noticed a certain retaliatory bent in her. I don't think she likes the nitty-gritty, day-to-day, immersed in the budget conversations that we had as my last full session was concluding. She just sort of came in with an arbitrary list and said, I want this stuff. She threatened other people's. I just don't think, even though she's a nice lady and you'd probably like to sit down and have a drink with her, I just don't think that she has executive mettle to run a multi-billion-dollar organization absent the pernicious and overbearing influence of SEIU and other partisans.
Great, thank you. Representative Drazen, could you explain your position on the red flag law? Because it's been reported by the Ben Bolton and the Oregonian that you said if elected governor, you would work to weaken that law, which, just so people understand, was passed in 2017 and would allow guns to be taken away from people who are deemed by a court to be a danger to themselves or others. Is it accurate that you would work to weaken that law?
It's not accurate that I would work to weaken that law.
So
what is accurate is that I have said, and I've been quite clear about this, that I believe in due process, and the extent to which the red flag laws themselves could be reviewed to ensure you protect due process. I think that's important. I have absolutely absolutely committed to ensuring that the red flag laws remain in place. I think that it's critical that we keep guns out of the hands of people who might harm themselves or others. And I think it's an important tool for law enforcement and certainly for family members and others who might live with someone experiencing a mental health crisis.
So what's your due process concern?
So the issues around that really do come down to how guns are removed, who in fact can flag those issues, and so it's just a matter of review. And so I've also said very clearly that in the first 100 days of my administration that I will be reviewing all rules and regulations to take a look at what's been going on over the course of the last 4 years with the executive branch, with sole Democrat control, to make determinations as to what in particular related to our economy would strengthen our economy and allow for businesses to grow and thrive and for projects to get done and permitting to occur faster. So there's a lot of work to be done really to just strengthen good government, and my intent around red flag laws and everything else, in fact, is to strengthen good government.
Okay. There's a measure on the ballot that would enshrine in the Constitution the concept that health care is a human right. Senator Johnson, how will you vote on that measure?
I believe that healthcare ought to be accessible, affordable, and clinically high quality. My concern with the universal healthcare is the downstream consequences. I don't know that we've analyzed the cost, and that's very concerning to me. We will set expectations very high that may or may not be able to be realized. I'm not sure that the state of Oregon is capable of taking on a project of that size and deliver it. Hell, they can't run DMV right now.
So, sounds like you're a no?
Pardon me?
Sounds like you're a no on this ballot measure?
I'd be a no, yeah.
Yes. Representative Drazen?
Yeah, I'd be a no as well. I believe they did assess the cost. I thought it was like $30 billion a year.
Well, interestingly, this measure was referred to the ballot with no fiscal. Yes,
Yeah.
remarkable.
Yeah, right.
That's Exhibit A and why it's pretty questionable.
But it's interesting, the Florida conversation was, I was saying, so this is either real and this is going to flood out the rest of the budget and this is now what state government's about, or it's aspirational. Which is it? And half the Democrats on the floor said this is aspirational, it's not going to affect our ability to fund core social services, the things we've been talking about today, behavioral health, schools, whatever. And then the other half said, no, this is actually what we want. And so I'm voting no. I think it's a train wreck. I don't think it's the right decision. We have 4 to 6% of all Oregonians that aren't currently covered by a plan, and the bulk of those are eligible today. To Tina's point, people living on our streets are eligible today to have access right now. This is a nice bumper sticker, but it's a terrible policy.
I'm in support of it. It's an aspirational goal. The way it was written is it clarifies the balance of, to meet the aspirational goal, to balance with other needs of the state. Oregonians believe healthcare is a fundamental right. I think you're going to see vast number of Oregonians who believe in that, and that's what the measure says, and I support it.
But to Representative Drazen's point, isn't this going to create expectations that we don't have the money to fund? Isn't it going to?
I think people have those expectations now. Don't you?
But so we're putting in this. We put it in the Constitution and say, and go ahead and sue us. But we will balance this with education. So it doesn't really change anything. I guess that's the point. It doesn't make anybody's life better.
I think some of the things we put in our Constitution are aspirational to say, what do we want as a state? And we believe in access to health care. We have fought hard to get people insured. Let's talk about access, though. And let's get back into the what it means for real people. Because I get asked about this a lot. Well, what do we do next? It's it's not enough to have people covered with health insurance. We have to make sure there's access to care. Let's go back to mental health and addiction. It's health care. We keep treating it as some other thing. We have mental health parity in this state. Our insurers should be providing access to mental health and addiction treatment the same way they do to primary care and specialty care. We need to really have a conversation about what does access to healthcare mean. That is the conversation I want to have. The measure in and of itself is fine. I'm going to support it. But let's make sure that we're actually moving forward and people get the healthcare they need.
But I do think it feels a little bit like the quality education model, doesn't it? The quality education model was very similar to this, where they said, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're committing to Oregonians, and they said, oh, by the way, it's completely unenforceable.
Yeah.
And this feels like that. But what if it's not unenforceable? What if they really do have the ability to sue in a way and enforce it? What are we going to do then?
That perhaps an unfunded mandate.
Yeah.
Senator Johnson?
Nigel, I'd like to make one other comment about good government. I think all three of us have touched on that. The fact that that measure came forward with no fiscal, and I know I'm not supposed to dig down into bygone legislative stuff, but I think that's a manipulation of the process. We trust these nonpartisan offices that are really run with the very heavy hand of the presiding officers. But we give the patina of trusting these nonpartisan offices to do the analysis to inform Oregonians, and to have that measure come to the floor with no fiscal, to me, is an abuse of the system. It is the absolute epitome of bad government, and it's stuff like that that I think just pisses off taxpayers and voters.
Okay, so you've been in the legislature a long time. Let's remember, the fiscal analyses are about the immediate impact. We all know the resolutions that come from the legislature to the ballot, the only fiscal that gets talked about is what's the cost on the ballot. Then there's a fiscal analysis that comes in the statement. If you didn't like how the statement was done, that's a different conversation, but don't mix the two. They're not the same.
Okay, go ahead, quick question.
Can I ask a quick question? There's a changing subject. There's an amendment to Multnomah County Charter, which those of us in Multnomah County will vote on, which would basically say that undocumented workers can vote in Multnomah County. And I'm wondering what you think of that and then the others.
Yeah, and so remind me, it's
It's a
that...
county charter change that allows people who are undocumented but over 18, that has nothing
To
do
vote
with
for
their workers,
non-federal stuff?
to
To vote for non-federal.
To vote for in non-federal. It's unclear whether they could vote in statewide, but they could
county.
certainly vote in local elections. So,
I haven't read it, so that makes me a little nervous because I always want to read these things before taking a position. But my gut check is that would be hard to implement because you'd have to add an entire layer of voter registration on here because through motor
Separate
voter.
ballot.
Yeah, I think that would, in separate ballot, that sounds really costly and complicated. So I would be really hesitant to support that.
Yeah, no.
Senator Johnson?
One more time, Nigel, mark it down. Tina and I agree. I'm a no.
Okay. All right.
Climate question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So, quick question on climate, which is on my mind because it's, about 15 degrees above normal for the last week, and there's a fire burning near Larch Mountain, and it's smoky. I drove through the Klamath Basin twice this summer, and lovely place. Did ride the rim at Crater Lake, and I gotta tell you, I don't think I've ever seen a place that's so affected by climate change. I mean, it's changing. I couldn't see the lake when I drove by one day because it was so smoky. You've talked about getting rid of the renewable fuel standard and doing away with some other executive actions on climate.
Technically
What's the plan?
suspending temporarily, not getting rid of. And frankly, the original legislation allowed for that based on price. And so I have talked about suspending it for purposes of addressing the crisis that families are facing right now with affordability. And so that's different than getting rid of it.
So you do something different down the road?
You would temporarily suspend it and then you'd reinstitute it again. So it's-
Reinstitute the same plan?
Yeah, all you do is you temporarily suspend. We're talking about clean fuels.
And we're doing that now because the economy's in rough shape?
We're doing that right now because of the price of gas at the tank today and the effect that people are experiencing from the impact of the Clean Fuels Program, which raises costs at the pump.
Isn't the price increase sort of a drop in the bucket compared to OPEC's cutting production?
There's no
production
doubt
by
that
2
that's
million
true, but I think you
barrels?
have to do what you can, where you can. It's entirely true that there are complex issues that impact the price of gas at the pump. But I think that recognizing that, you do what you can where you can.
Okay. Anybody else on climate?
Well, that is a really nuanced approach now because at the debate you said you'd get rid of the low carbon fuel
I said
program.
suspend.
It's
There's a
not-
difference.
okay. Well, the Clean Fuels Program is very effective. It's the #1 thing we're doing in our state to reduce carbon emissions from transportation fuels. It's effective. It's cost effective, and
So you would disagree with her? You would not suspend?
absolutely. I have fought to keep that program going. Now, here's what I would say is, I hear from, Representative Drazen and Senator Johnson that they believe in climate change. No proposals about
sure.
that. No,
Just to flag it.
to be
you
honest,
there.
I think both of you will say anything to get elected on this issue because you do not have a plan. You have opposed everything. And yes, you have said you would rip up the executive orders. You don't have a plan. You can't say you care about climate action and then not have an option.
Tina, I thought you knew my legislative record. I'm a little bit surprised.
What legislative record? I've sat in rooms with you when you have brought nothing to the table on this issue. Nothing.
I actually signed on to legislation in the last session that supported very specific federal response to this and in fact testified in support of it in the Senate. You guys killed it in the House.
I have no
but-
idea what you're talking about.
I know, I'm really surprised.
Well, can you tell us what bill you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it was SJM 5, something like that.
The memorial resolution to Congress?
Yes, I support
That is your
federal
climate
action.
plan.
Here's the thing. Oregon has been carrying a disproportionate burden given our actual impact on climate. And what we actually need, this is my actual perspective on this, I've told you this a million times, is that the right approach to climate is to approach this at a federal level. And the reason is because our state, as small as it is, as mighty and beautiful as it is, should not be disproportionately impacted. You need a plan that does not, in fact, harm businesses and economies within your state border. You need a plan that actually has an effect on a global scale. You can achieve that with federal action. My support for the proposal said, this in fact is a carbon tax. All of it then gets returned to Oregonians. You're not growing government. It had a suspension of additional regulations over the term that it was initially being implemented. It was a well-rounded and appropriate response to climate at the federal level, which I have always supported.
Okay.
Did
Senator
you-
Johnson,
did you
low carbon
support-
fuel standard?
Oh, I just want to ask, did you, just quickly, would you support the Inflation Reduction Act then? That's a federal attempt to.
It's 100%
deal with
a
climate.
federal attempt, but that's literally a federal attempt that's all about increasing revenues for the government. That is
So you
not the
didn't,
same.
you would vote no on that
No.
if you were in
No,
the
so-
House or the Senate? Yes, okay,
So
sorry.
I'm not running for Congress, but yeah.
Understood.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a federal response.
Senator
Yeah,
Johnson,
yeah.
low carbon fuel standard.
I want to comment first on the Klamath Basin. That was the original question.
Yeah.
Governor Brown discharged a team led by Richard Whitman down there to try to find a resolution. And I don't know what happened after all the money that was spent, after all the effort. The appearance to some of us that watched from a distance was, this got really hard and complicated and we just walked away. I was down in Klamath Falls and met with some producers and irrigators, and this one young kid that was there at the table, I said, what are you going to do when you finish high school? And he said, I'd like to go to OSU and get some education in agribusiness so I could come back and run my father's ranch, but there won't be any water. And I don't know when, by the time I come up, if that's going to be soluble. I just think that that's another example, apropos your question about Governor Brown's administration of the state. We don't have a solution, and she listed that as a high priority for a very long time. And so I just make that observation.
In the low carbon fuel standard, Representative Drazen said she would suspend it. Kotek says that's a bad idea. What would you do with the low carbon fuel standard?
I would want to review how the low carbon fuel standard has been embedded in an administrative rule. I think while Kate Brown has had her head turned and is not watching the agencies, that an awful lot of liberties have been taken by biased state agency heads to build all sorts of strictures into administrative rule. Some of that low carbon fuel standard is driving costs that are making Oregon an unattractive place to either retain or recruit business. And while I'm very supportive of doing what Oregon can, given our de minimis share of global climate crisis, I think we ought to pay attention to the fiscal aspects and just how difficult it has made as far as the business climate here. I would say that Oregon ought to focus on the unique things that we are able to do. Specifically, don't let the place burn down every year. We need to harmonize our forest management with our federal partners who own a big chunk of this state. We need to harmonize firefighting. The Fed's philosophy is to let fires get way ahead of us before we go in and put them out. Oregon has earned, and appropriately so, an international reputation for initial attack. We don't do that anymore. We let these fires get way out of control before we go in. As governor, I would make sure that we not only negotiated aggressively with our federal delegation to harmonize those federal and state response to both forest management and fire, but I would also build into my budget plenty of money for air assets, boots on the ground to go fight these fires, fight them aggressively. And I think we have gotten away from that. One of the prime objectives of government in Oregon is don't let the place burn down on our watch.
Okay, two last questions, then we're done. Thank you all for giving us so much time. The first is we're going to ask each of you to ask one opponent a question. Can be either of them. Has to be a question that can be answered. Please don't start with a filibuster. So ideally, it would be a question that gives us some insight into an important distinction between you or something you want us to know about an opponent. So I'm talking a little bit to give you guys all a chance to think of these questions. The question after that will be a fun question. So this is our last unfun question. And
One question to one person.
one question to one person. Again, it ought to be something specific, it ought to be answerable, and it shouldn't be just you making a statement. I will give Steve Kotek the first chance to ask either of your opponents a question.
I'm going to ask Representative Drazen a question. What did you mean when you told the Bend Bulletin in your interview that you were looking forward to the conversation of how we could restrict abortion?
First of all, I didn't say that in the Bend Bulletin, so it's important that you actually are accurate when you talk about my comments. What I said to the Bend Bulletin was, we have a lot of very hard, thorny conversations that we have in our public life. In the legislature, we talk about difficult things. We talk about gun laws, we talk about education, suicide rates, affordability, taxes, you name it, complex issues. But the thing that's always off the table, and has always been off the table, we're not able to achieve a civil conversation about it, is abortion access. Oregon happens to be a state that has access to abortion all the way up to birth. That's not common. That's not mainstream. That's unusual. That's outside the mainstream for what most states have for their abortion laws. Elective abortion up until birth is very different than is there a heartbeat? Can you feel pain? Is it a fetus or a child or a baby? That's not that. We're talking right before birth. But as Oregonians, and frankly as public policy makers, we haven't been able to have any conversation about anything, about what is choice and what is child. It doesn't exist. We're not able to bridge that divide. Now, all I said in the Bend Bulletin was that it is unfortunate that we can't do that. And I would hope someday within our civic life that we're able to achieve this conversation where we can have a civil conversation about what does that mean for us as Oregonians. It's the one thing no one can talk about. It's the one thing that nobody ever is allowed to talk about, but we are a complete outlier. We mandate it in public insurance, we mandate it in private insurance, we pay for, tourist abortions into our state, and we allow abortions right up until birth. That is not normal for every other state in the nation. And yet, there's no civil conversation that it's allowed on any of it. That was what I was talking to the Bend Bulletin about. And what I thought was interesting was that his question of me was not a highly charged partisan question. His question of me felt like he wanted to actually know what I thought about the issue. And that doesn't happen on this topic. People want to light you on fire, and which is what you've been doing in the race.
Using phrases like tourist abortion, I can kind of see why.
Well, it's public dollars, and it's intended for people outside of our state.
So it's fair to say that if you become governor, you would like this state to have a conversation about abortion.
And here's how I ended the Bend conversation. I am not running for governor to have that conversation. So, we talk about whether or not the ballot measure was aspirational.
Right.
I recognize we can't have that conversation. I am more interested in doing good things for Oregonians than having a divisive conversation on a topic people don't want to talk about. But he asked me a question, and I thought it was sincere.
Okay.
And there you go.
Great.
Okay, Representative Drazen, would you like to ask either of your opponents a question?
Sure. Tina, you talked a lot about we just need to continue on the path that we're on and work harder, and we just need to do better, but that we're in a good place. The only failing has been the executive. I would like for you to tell me anything, any policy, just policy, not administration, but policy, that Kate Brown has instituted or supported that you want to change. What part of the status quo, not administratively, but an actual policy, do you think is wrong and you want to change?
Well, I don't think that's a fair characterization of how I think of the world right now. Things are not working well. Things are not on track. I wouldn't be running for governor if I thought they were, because this is a lot of work. we have to get things on track. And I've always been an advocate and a change person. I'm about change, I'm about progress. So I just want to put that up front. There are probably a lot of things. The only one that is popping into my mind right now from a policy perspective, and I'm sorry if this is going to get a little wonky, because there are a lot of things. I didn't agree with the governor when she vaccinated teachers over seniors. I mean, that's a very specific thing. But policy today. When the state agency puts out money, hundreds of millions of dollars for housing construction, and everybody who's applying for these grants thinks that the plan is, this is what we did last time, so we're all applying for these grants to build affordable housing. And then on the day that the announcement for request for applications goes out, this is the LIFT program, the agency completely changes the rules. And affordable housing developers are like, well, if I had known those rules had changed, I would have built this property in a different place, or I would have done it differently. The agency literally changed the rules on the day they threw out the applications to our affordable housing developers on the next round of LIFT. And I was furious.
But is that a policy or is that administratively? I feel like that's administrative response.
That's policy, right? The legislature says there's a program, the agency changes their minds and screws up affordable housing projects for the next, year. That's a policy change. That's, I guess I don't know what to me that's a policy
You
thing.
still support the LIFT program, you didn't like how it was implemented at an agency level. That's administrative. I'm just asking what policy is out there right now.
I think
that you
that's a
don't
policy choice that's not administrative. Someone made a policy choice internally that I disagree with. So I'm answering the question. That's very specific.
Okay, Senator Johnson, would you like to ask a question of either of your opponents?
Yes, please. Tina, you played an oversized role in monitoring sexual allegations of harassment in the legislature, especially in the House. Under your management, the state paid out $1 million of taxpayer money. Why has it, to settle those cases, why has it taken 600 days to adjudicate Representative Diego Fernandez's case with a contract employee who could only interview 5 witnesses in the space of those 600 days and was pretty secretive in releasing information?
The answer to that, just straight up, is I don't know. Because I was as frustrated as everyone else how long it took. It should have been done, I don't know, within the timeline. Let's remember that when the Legislative Equity Office was set up in the legislature, it was based on the elements of the lawsuit that you talk about and the Oregon Law Commission's recommendations that there should be a complete firewall between the presiding officers, the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, on the oversight of the Legislative Equity Office. That had been tasked to the Conduct Committee, which is made up of members selected by the chambers to run those things. I had nothing to do with the running of that office. I even left office, that thing was still going. It should have been resolved long ago, and as it was, those were unsubstantiated claims. It's been resolved. I assume there'll be a hearing. I have no idea, because I wasn't in charge of that.
So I think your reputation as somebody who got a lot of bills passed in Salem, very accurate. You did a lot of hard things in Salem.
Sure.
You were very efficient. Sometimes you steamrollered people if they got in your way. Yet here we have this, as you say, it's unfounded. You say you had nothing to do with it. I understand the Legislative Equity Office was set up to be independent. But if you're in charge and they're over here doing nothing, it's hard to reconcile your reputation for efficiency with this gross inefficiency.
I follow the law,
investigation.
Nigel. The complaint that the suit that was filed by Boley under former Labor Commissioner Brad Avakian was settled with the legislature. That settlement was very clear that there would not be any undue influence or interaction between the presiding officers, the Speaker and the Senate President, with the Legislative Equity Office. We followed, and then we passed a resolution to implement that. I'm following the rules of the House. Like when somebody would call me and say, there's this thing, I'm like, you must call the LEO. I have nothing to do with this anymore. I'm not saying that was a great idea, because now what we're seeing is that you need some oversight when there's management of something within the branch, and maybe they didn't get it right. But I followed what was put out. And you might not believe it, but that's the deal. There's a firewall. That means no conversations.
All right, last question. If the world were going to end tonight and you could only eat or drink one thing before the world ended, we're asking this question of all candidates, by the way, not just the candidates for governor. What would it be? Representative Drazen, let's start with you on this.
One thing.
One thing.
on the menu.
One.
Yes, one item.
You can have other things, but this is the one you have to have.
Have to have this. So I'm gonna say seared ahi.
Seared ahi,
With
sounds pretty
wasabi.
good. Yes, you can have wasabi.
Okay,
All right.
has to have the wasabi.
Okay. Senator Johnson.
Probably a glass of Jack Daniels.
Okay. I like it. All right. Speaker Cote.
Because that's a food item. Okay.
He said drink.
Drink.
Oh, you did say drink.
You know, when the long campaign trail, you think of things you really love to eat. How about the sour cherry dumplings from Kachka?
Sour
Nice.
cherry dumplings.
Nice, yeah. that is
All right. Okay, well,
Look at
thank
us
you
being
all.
all brought together. buddy.
Food, that's what food does, food and drink, as it turns
Okay,
out.
great. Well, thank you all very much for your time. We appreciate it. We're sorry you couldn't be with us in
Yeah,
person.
get better,
Senator.
Betsy.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.